When people say self-defense, they imagine a lot of things. Sifu Alan Baker doesn't have to. He's applied it in the dojo, on the street, and in professional applications as a bodyguard and security consultant. He's the real deal, and we have a real talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of how parents can apply these important skills. If you haven't already, don't forget to like and subscribe, and do come find us on Facebook, or sign up at Patreon for early access and members-only goodies. Thanks for watching. Now let's get to work. I'd like to introduce you all to two close personal friends of the show. John and John are a pair of law enforcement officers with 3 decades of combined experience in helping people stay safe and what happens when that fails. They've built a shop, Shield Protection Products, that offers a full range of self-defense items like pepper spray and stun guns that real people can use in the real world. They're like-minded folks, so they also offer important safety equipment like fire extinguishers, medical kits, and car escape tools. They provide an instructional video with every purchase so you know how to use anything you buy. Find them at shieldprotectionproducts.com and use the discount code SFOTB10 to get 10% off of your purchase. That's SFOTB10 at shieldprotectionproducts.com. Seriously, friends, if you're looking for the best equipment to keep your family safe, along with advice from knowledgeable professionals on how to use it, while supporting this show and a small business that deserves it, you'll find it at Shield Protection Products. Go check them out and tell them Safest Family on the Block sent you. Hello, everybody, and welcome again to Safest Family on the Block, where knowledge is power. I'm your host, Jason, and with me today is Sifu Alan Baker. Hello, Sifu. How are you doing today?
Hi, guys. How you doing? Thanks for having me.
It's absolutely my privilege. Now, you sent me your bio a couple of days ago, and it's some heavy reading in and of itself. But the highlights: Sifu Alan Baker is a high-performance coach and internationally recognized martial arts and self-defense expert. He's been training continuously in the martial arts since 1981 and teaching since 1990. He has 40 years of continuous experience in the art. He's the author of The Warrior's Path, a warrior-based approach to personal change, and is the Civilian Tactical Training Association founder, and he's appeared in several national magazine articles. He's been privileged to work with and design training programs for the Department of Defense, the CIA, other specialized government and military groups like the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. He is a certified armed personal protection specialist and the defensive tactics instructor for the Executive Protection Institute in Clark County, Virginia. And he created a specialized defensive tactics program for protection agents, that's bodyguards, named Protection Response Tactics. And I read about a third of what's on there. Suffice to say, so that you know what you're talking about. And one of the things when we were talking about what we'd feature on the show with you, you brought up the interesting point about adapting your training.
Yeah.
Where what you learn to apply in situation A may bear very little resemblance to situation B.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's start a little bit with, what do you mean by adapting your training?
Well, in the martial arts industry, most people will come into the academy and they want to learn a system. And you may be relatively unfamiliar with defensive tactics or martial arts, so you pretty much rely on that system and that instructor to tell you what you need to know and the truth of it. And in just combat, where I don't have to worry about legalities, how things look visually or accepted socially, then it's perfect. But once we learn it, we have to go back out and apply that in the real world. And some of the things that you're taught, actually quite a few things that you're taught in the martial arts, though fantastic. I mean, love martial arts, obviously. It may not apply to your given environment, and the environment can change. So you have to, unless you have somebody that can digest that for you and help you break it down and implement it into your own environment or culture, you have to do it on your own. So, I actually have quite a few of those discussions on what it takes to do that, and lift the potential students out of a systemized mindset which is very easy to get into the beginning because we don't know. We go and we ask this teacher, we ask this system, what's the answer? And they're like, well, here's your answer. That is all you need. So it's easy to kind of get caught up in the systemized thought patterns. And if you can't find somebody that can help you understand it and pull yourself out of it, then we have to do it for ourselves, and make adjustments to our own training and our plans in case we get confronted with violence.
Well, that's very congruent with how this show actually happened to begin with. I adopted my first son when he was 7 years old. And at that time, I was a fourth degree black belt who'd been pretty stupid in his 20s. I was stone badass, Kempo guy, right? And it occurred to me, I was in class teaching the Kempo gun disarms, and you've got enough experience, you're probably passingly familiar at least. But most of those end up, you capture the arm and you kind of put it past you at about hip level, which is right where my 8-year-old son would very likely be standing.
Right. Yeah.
If I were in that situation. So I think that's an illustration of exactly what you're talking about, where once my circumstances changed and I had a child with me for whom I was responsible, I had to reassess certain aspects of my training.
Agreed.
And I think another example that a lot of our listeners might be familiar with is if you are a 5'2", 110-pound woman, is a 6', 250-pound Marine, he's about the reality of a confrontation or a physical situation that just aren't appropriate for you.
Mm-hmm. True.
So when we're talking about adapting our training, whether it's a military person who comes back from the theater and what he would do in a violent confrontation when he was deployed is absolutely not appropriate for somebody mouthing off at a bar, for example. If you ask 1,000 people, they're all going to have 1,000 different approaches. And then if you ask them next year, you have to make it 2,000 because they've changed as well.
Right.
So we can't create a system for adapting your system because that kind of defeats the purpose. But are there some general principles or techniques that we can use as we start to do that exploration?
Yes, definitely. One thing that when I start to have this talk or I do this lecture is I like to discuss primal environments. And what a primal environment is pretty much what a human being will do in a violent encounter, whether he's trained or untrained. You don't have to have training to make a fist and swing at somebody. Obviously, if you do, you're better at it. But even untrained, it's going to be a reaction. People will grab onto you. They're headhunters under stress, and they'll try to grab your wrist and stop you from doing different things or hold you, which is pummeling. And sometimes you end up on the ground, either by choice or not by choice, because gravity's not just a good idea; it's the law. So you can end up there, and they've learned in the last 20 or 30 years, when two human machines end up on the ground in a fight, they end up in certain positions. It's just primal. And so is the nature of picking up an edged weapon or something blunt and just using it. You don't have to be trained there either. And a lot of firearm training, projectile training is the same way. So when we take those environments into consideration, we know that we need answers in them. And it kind of gives us a nice way to clearly define what slots we need to fill with our training. And then we can go find simple answers that we can implement and, do continuously over time to ingrain the reactions in the body and have an answer. This also gives the approach that isn't systemized necessarily, because I didn't mention one system. It's based on the blueprint of violence, which also can help simplify your search. And give you a general reference if you're working with an instructor. If you can kind of have that reference as you go in, you can determine on your own what you need, what you don't need. And with that in mind, we also have to take into consideration that the legalities of it. And this will vary by state. And the baseline I use is really the same baseline I use when I'm doing different firearms training, which is jeopardy, opportunity, and ability. If violence, even just an empty hand, mistakes can happen. And you may even be in the right and pop that guy and him fall down, hit his head on the sidewalk, and now you're liable for it. And you're going to receive more damage legally past that than you can imagine. I've actually had students come to me after this type of experience and was like, I want to learn something, but this didn't work out so good for me. How can I fix it? So we kind of need an idea of a force continuum that leads up to that determination of jeopardy, opportunity, and ability. Much like law enforcement officers, the threat sometimes determines the response. And we have to do that as civilians too. You can't just go out there and do certain things. Like your martial arts teacher teaches you a stance, your hands go up like this. And the truth is, if the threat is just wolfing you or verbally encountering you, and you make a physical threat, you're in the wrong. So how we end up in those stances, when we choose to place ourselves in a position of mechanical power because we're expecting something, we have to take that into consideration. It has to be visually appropriate as well, because cell phones, somebody is going to record it more than likely, or there's going to be one hanging in the store, side of a house. There's almost nowhere you can go and get away from it. So you have to choose things, even though it's not the funnest thing to do, but that is going to be visually appropriate. It has to fit into that force continuum. And on some levels, it has to be socially acceptable, because a lot of that is taken into consideration after the event when you have to articulate it to a law enforcement officer, attorney, or a judge. And that articulation a lot of times will be based on your understanding of those things. If you have a force continuum for yourself personally, if this happens, I know I can elevate in force here. If that happens, I can elevate in force there. Where did
Sorry
I lose?
about that. Someone just tried to call in and it jacked up. No, we got it all on the video, but my phone's acting up. Someone tried to call me. Yeah, I didn't identify them, so we just ignore it because it's probably someone trying to tell me about my auto warranty, right?
Hey, you got to take care of those things, right?
Yeah, good Lord. All righty. So you're on about the visual appropriateness, which is a consideration I think isn't taught well in martial arts schools, and that a lot of people who don't have any training have never thought about, where that your response could be 100% appropriate for the situation from your point of view, but it might look very different on that security camera that doesn't have the angle exactly right and isn't bringing on audio, so they don't hear that person murmuring threats at you, or the camera angle doesn't see that they might be holding something in their hand. And so that consideration of visual appropriateness is one of several things that sounds like you're talking about with adapting, where we take what looks good on the mat or wins awards and trophies could very well be seen as an unnecessary threat display.
Correct.
And go towards misframing your frame of mind.
And it's unfortunate that we have to take those things into consideration. And what's really terrible about it is most people figure this out after the fact. You'll go and you get that education because it's important to have an education, especially if you're in the position that you mentioned, like you're with a loved one or good friends, and like yourself, you've had training, and I'm sure that you've been in those situations in the past where something will come up that raises the intent a little bit, and everybody looks over at you.
Yeah.
Okay. And, people have been placed in that situation, and they've been trained, they've gone and they've done what they were told to do. And then they're in trouble legally afterwards.
Right.
And because I've had several of those over the year come in, and they're like, well, I was told this. And I found out for 2 years going through a legal process that I cannot do that. And can you give me that answer? And, fortunately, we have a program that does that. And so we're like, come on in.
And you had discussed that you kind of mentioned the steps of that, but I think a lot of our viewers could use a little more information about it starts with jeopardy, opportunity, and means, was it?
Yeah.
Where you assess.
Different ways of saying it.
Yeah.
When I first learned it and got introduced to it, it was jeopardy, opportunity, and the ability. And it was related to firearm training too, but even empty hand defense, knife defense, I tell the guys the same thing because it's very simple, and simplicity keeps the mind clear under tremendous amounts of stress. So the simpler, the better a lot of times. So we'll use that same process to determine when it's time to elevate. We also take into consideration, like we said earlier, we want the threat to determine it a lot of times. And, that of course we have to use judgment there, depending on the situation. And it's important to know in advance, have an idea. If you can't do it in a classroom, we call it on the sidewalk because we set up a sidewalk in our school, and you will encounter you. And from the verbal exchange all the way up to deadly force, but you don't know what's coming, and that's the hard part. A lot of people get stuck in that moment pre-violence of, I can't believe this is happening to me. Is this guy serious? And even when they start to physically engage you, like, oh, should I do this now? You don't know, and that mind freeze sometimes will put you behind in time. And that's the thing too, you don't train that in martial arts either. You don't work on the gift of gab or the social exchange that happens prior to an event. And if you struggle with that, then it's right downhill. It's going to go physical pretty quick. And you should really, develop the ability to do it and recognize when an individual's doing it to you. We generally break it down into a couple of stages, but a threat will interview you. Sometimes they'll, could be as simple as asking you for $1. Can I use your cell phone? I really like those shoes. And they're wanting to see what your response is going to be. They will read your body language, how you respond verbally, what do your eyes do? And I think most threats don't want a physical exchange. They want an easy meal. And so if they can see that in your body language, that's what you're going to be, then they'll generally elevate it to the next level. We nickname it wolfing. So they may increase the stressful exchange a little more, and see what reaction they get. And sometimes it will shut people down. If you're not used to it, like we said earlier, you have that mind freeze moment. And if they see that, they'll take advantage of it. And I think a lot of them may not even want physical exchange. You may just want you to give them some money. And if they can intimidate it out of you easily, they've won and they walk off. So even that verbal interaction leading up to the moment of touch, huge. It's an art into itself that is a ghost town in most martial arts schools.
So listen, if you've gotten this far into the show, you like what I'm doing here. So do I, but I need your help to make it all it can be. For just $10 a day, you can help this happen by supporting the show on Patreon. In return, you'll get my undying thanks, early access to episodes, a monthly safety worksheet, and other cool goodies. We're at patreon.com/safestfamily and waiting for your help. Please consider it. It's $3 a month to you, but a big deal to me.
So it's
in most training across the board, I think you're not
Right.
really taught that when you're doing your rifle work at the range. You're not.
Yeah.
I think only police get substantial training in that verbal prevention of violence.
right.
But even within a police officer in uniform with the car there and the blues flashing compared to that same human being off duty, that's such a different environment, such a different context alone that they need to adapt.
Agreed. And most of the time, the law enforcement, when they put on the uniform, they're already elevated in their level of awareness just because of the environment they have to operate in. And we don't necessarily think about that as regular civilians unless we've had this discussion or the training.
Yeah, what's the opposite of protective coloration? Because I think that's in many ways what a police officer's uniform is.
Yeah, it's just a visual presence, which is a lot of reason why when they're on scene, just the presence of an officer, they train them and rely on it too.
And it changes the dynamic completely.
Agreed.
And I think that's a lot of what this idea of adapting your training gets down to, which is when we train, no matter how excellent that training is, we are training for A.
Mm-hmm.
But reality is going to be B, almost always.
Yes, that's true.
And so one of the things is we can change our training, adapt our training, seek different training that, for example, take a verbal judo course to help us pass that interview. Train, take some legal defense courses so that we understand better how to articulate our decision to use force. But that verbal judo class with an instructor who is not going to shiv you, and the worst thing that's going to happen to that class is you embarrass yourself in front of a couple of colleagues, versus trying to access those skills in a mostly empty parking garage when someone's approaching you with intent.
Correct.
What are some ways that we can help ourselves make that transition from A to B and make the most out of the training we do get so that we can survive what the situation actually becomes?
Well, on the verbal side of it, play games. It's the same thing we do in the academy. It's the wonderful thing about the academy is you have a culture of like-minded individuals, most of the time growth-minded individuals, and they're all there looking for that moment of embarrassment because wisdom comes out of it. But if you're not in the academy and you have a significant other who understands what you're doing, and and you're doing it to help the family, to protect, you can work your gift of gab with them. You can take ideas and just play verbally. Hey, I need $1. Would you loan me $1? Can I borrow your cell phone? And you act and play just like you do in a martial arts class. When you first get out there, you don't know how to fight. And even a year or two in, you really don't. But you're playing, you're slowly immersing yourself in that environment so that you can start to, one, get your nervous system accustomed to what's going on, the levels of stress, and gradually and intelligently raise it over time. So we can do the same thing verbally. We just need a partner to play. And if we don't have a partner, you always have the shower. You have the car on the way to work. And, it sounds silly, but like the guys that we've trained here at the school who have got on the sidewalk a few times, when they start making a change and developing those skills, we'll notice they'll get a little sharper on their verbal tools. And we'll go, hey, what are you doing? Is it class? And many times they say, I play at red lights. I argue with myself just so I can develop the ability to articulate and verbally exchange. And they determine what tools they're going to use in advance. Just like in martial arts, if he does A, you're going to do B. So if they're asking for money, what is my response? I use a lot of humor on my verbal responses because I've done it in real life, and I've noticed that it de-escalates. It doesn't necessarily place you in the tough guy position, but I don't really care about that. Like if I'm with Jennifer or one of my friends, my ultimate goal is to protect myself and protect them. So if I look a little silly, that's okay, as long as I make it from point A to point B. But you determine in advance, what's my response going to be? Hey, I don't have any money. I gave it all to my wife, so I'm broke. I won't get paid for another 2 weeks. So maybe I'll meet you back here in 2 weeks, and we can have a talk then. But if you could pick it out in advance, because it's easier to know when than what. Yeah, so if you have a few of those tools picked out and you've practiced them a few times in the car, in the shower, when you get that exchange, hopefully they'll come up on your internal screen and you can use them. That and posturing works both ways. We know threats will use posturing to intimidate and try to control the situation. You become aware of your posture. How do you hold yourself? How do you project in a situation like that? And pretty much physical communication, which we know from study that it's 80 to 90% of communication, really. We have so much interaction physically, but we don't train it too often, which is basically what they're doing in martial arts schools. This is a form of communication. And a lot of people are like, well, I don't want anything to do with that. It's just the legal side of it that's you have to tweak a little bit and take into consideration.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. See also public speaking. Yes. I think where people are so nervous about public speaking because often when we have a student who comes back and says, man, this didn't work. I got assaulted. I got beat up. It often is because those higher order thinking skills are the first things to go under stress.
Absolutely.
And so stress inoculation, like going and volunteering to give a speech, joining Toastmasters. And so you get used to saying what you plan to say while your legs are shaking and your stomach's a little queasy and you're having the flop sweats. Yes. That, again, A isn't B, but that A is closer to B in some ways than practicing with your buddies and under less stressful circumstances, I would think.
It's another plug for a good academy, because a good school, as you progress and you get intermediate to advanced, they'll put you up front. They'll have you teach. And, in my experience, I was fortunate to have some really good mentors, and they would talk to you about your physical presence, your projection when you taught. They weren't so much concerned about your teaching, maybe in the beginning to make sure you were doing the right thing, but they developed that ability to communicate verbally, energetically, physically. So it's a good environment to play as well. If you are looking for something to work.
Absolutely. I think we could go back and forth all day on how great martial arts is. I love it.
I agree.
Preaching to the choir a little bit. But I think your point is very, very strong that what we do in the dojo isn't what's going to happen in the street. And a lot of martial arts programs really do miss the boat on a lot of the training possibilities. You mentioned that 80% or whatever the number is of communication is nonverbal, and whatever the scientists figured out this week, it's certainly way more than half, right?
Yes.
the overwhelming majority of self-defense, especially if you have kids you're responsible for, especially if you're walking around with your parents who are in their 80s, is non-physical. It's that voice, it's that verbal ability, it's the stance, it's your awareness, it's being willing to leave the bar at the first sign of trouble and not wait for it to actually develop.
Right.
And what are some ways I think one of the challenge for a lot of folks is, especially men, I don't want to be sexist, but men are dumber as a general rule. I am not the brains in my marriage, I'll tell you that much. But there's that thing where we feel challenged and we feel an almost a visceral desire to puff up when what we should do is get in the damn car and go home.
Correct.
What are some good ways that you discovered to train that out of the high speed, low drag, aerodynamically efficient, athletic guys who often end up in the gym?
Yeah. Well, in my experience and how I was trained, it comes down to emotional control, which I learned a lot of it in the roots of Chinese Kung Fu, which is Qigong. And you will start training it just like you do anything else. One is becoming aware of it. And, untrained emotions will kick your butt all day long. Somebody will pull out in front of you in traffic and you'll be yelling at them. They do something in a store and in your mind you're going, yelling at them. Well, those
Practiced
moments,
in that conversation at the red light once again on the way home.
That's right. When you have those moments and you are aware that, there's an emotional rise of energy in the body, you become aware of it. And in Kung Fu, we say you'll root it. You pretty much want to relax it, take a deep breath, and let it sink. It takes time. I've done it for many years before I got to the point where something will happen and I'm just, go on. But it's just the same thing as a physical expression in the gym. That's a wonderful thing about a warrior culture. And you don't have to be in the academy to practice it. You don't have to be in a warrior environment to practice it. But when we just recognize that they'll a lot of times learn those things physically first. And once they understand the principle physically, they'll apply it emotionally and mentally. So just your ability to take a deep breath and relax your body and let that tension sink and go out of the body, the same thing will happen emotionally. Now, again, like we said, takes a little training. You have to get used to it. And training means consistently working something continuously over time. But just like anything, you will get better at it. And once you start to become a little better at it and more controlled, your ability to handle it under stress increases. And, not to come back to brag on the academy, but once you start to have that, you go, I'm getting pretty good at this. The guy cut me off in traffic. I had pretty good control. I didn't let it, I saw the thing on social media. Well, I'm okay. I was in charge. So once I have that, I'll start to place it under some type of chaos, some type of stressor. And like you're a martial artist, you did this your whole career. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the academy, but you can say, how can I create an opportunity that's going to create emotional rise so I can practice? And now you can create it, but as we both know, life will do it for you sometimes. But those moments in life, sometimes it'll get away from you. Before then you realize it and go, I got to bring it back in, calm it back down and relax. So that's a couple of ways that you can do it. Wait on those life moments and then consider it a moment to practice, which can be tough sometimes. But just like we were speaking earlier, know what you're going to do in advance so that when it happens, then all you have to do is choose when. So when I feel that charge, and just let the relaxation and sink and try to root yourself and the emotional energies and gain control over it. I think life will give you these
I
skills
think,
with wisdom over time,
especially as a parent, I think that everything you're saying there also applies to any parent with a teenager. Because if you want to talk about life handing you reasons to be upset.
Perfect example.
Yeah. Shameless plug for our interview with Alex Bromley, the verbal judo coach, for anybody who needs that. So I wanted to kind of shift gears a little bit because we've mostly been talking about trained martial artists taking a look what they've learned and moved it out. But a lot of parents, they haven't been in the dojo since they were a kid, and they maybe don't have the time, or they don't have the interest in some significant training. But I imagine there are a handful of things that we can do in our daily life that somebody only has a few minutes a day to practice can do to apply some of these techniques to making their families safer. What are the things, if there was one thing that a parent took home and thought about and worked with in their off hours, what would it be?
Gain access to some sort of information. Like I have individuals that I'll only see a couple of times a year due to their schedules. But we say it's the study of violence, and not necessarily to apply it, but to recognize it, deal with it. And there's a scale. So take the time to find a source of information and sit down and take a look at it intelligently. We mentioned looking at it through the filter of primal environments. It should be simple, effective, and you can choose an answer that will fit in each area. And take the time as often as you can to practice. And I have guys who will visually practice most of the year due to their jobs. They're protection agents, so they're on the clock 20 hours a day. If the client wakes up at 8, they've got to be up at 5. So they practice a lot visually, and then they may have a physical opportunity to practice 4 times a year. If your life's that busy, that's okay. You just say, I have these 4 times a year. I'm going to take this 2 hours on this one day, and I'm going to work on these things. I might get my buddy to come work on it, or I might be by myself in the garage and just kind of run through the motions. Introduce your body to the mechanics of the movements, whatever they may be. And even just considering you're doing it that many times a year is more better, definitely. But a lot of people, they'll say, well, I can't do it like that guy, so I just won't do it at all. And that's not true. You can get something out of it if you plug it in on your schedule and take the time to study the information, put a little verbal energy into it, a little physical energy into it, and you'll, at the very least, you'll implement it or implant it into the mind. So when the time comes, it may be more readily available to you, and you won't have to seek it for the answer. What was that I did, or what was that I saw on TV? So at the very least, I would suggest that. One step above that is to take the time to find a mentor. And you don't have to necessarily join a school. I have had students come in, they thought they had to join the school. And a lot of those individuals are the ones I'll see 3 or 4 times a year. They run multiple businesses. They have a family. So they'll come in and we'll take a look at where they are. How's their practice on their basics going? Brush it up a little bit. I'll see you next time. So you don't necessarily have to take that extra time out of your week. You know, I don't have the time. Yeah, I'm a good teacher will put a plan together for you that'll work around your schedule, even if you're just seeing them like every 3 months. So if you're not taking the opportunity to buy a downloadable DVD or something that gives you some information, have a conversation with that local instructor and see if he will work with you in that way. That's another option. And this take the time to kind of ingrain what you can in the nervous system. Then you add in what we discussed verbally. And you know, we really haven't even breached the subject of firearms yet. It's become a popular one in the last year.
Yeah.
I go to the range probably every 2 weeks, and the counters have been barren
Yeah.
for a year now. So you know, it's becoming more popular training. A lot of people have armed themselves in the last year, and they have no clue what they're doing with it. You know, and so it's important to take that into consideration too.
I think that that almost warrants a public service announcements. You know, the topic of guns is very fraught depending where you live and who you hang out with. And I'm not here to judge you one way or the other on that, but some of what we're saying about a little bit of training is really is better than no training at all.
Correct.
Just having a gun and a little bit of training, that's not a good idea. If you're going to take on the responsibility of having a gun, you need to train with it in a dedicated fashion.
That's true. And, you know, generally that dedicated fashion is a little more than what most people expect.
Yeah.
I agree. I have, we have a lot of that type of training go through the academy here. And so we have those enlightened conversations on a regular basis. And it is achievable. You know, it's the hardest part, I think, is just taking the step into the culture. You know, because it's new. It's like walking into an academy. It takes a lot to do that. Same thing with the firearm industry and the training side of it. So, but it's important, especially if that is something you choose to do. Definitely have to consistently work on those tools. They are perishable.
Whereas with unarmed training or the verbal stuff, even a little bit is better than nothing at all.
Agreed.
One of the it always feels a little bit like that story, the Three Billy Goats Gruff, where you sell your big brother, you know, up the river to the troll, but the bad guys are cowards. And like you said earlier, they're not looking to fight. They're looking for the quickest, easiest way to get the thing they want.
Right.
And if you have even a little bit of training, you're going to walk and move and talk in a way that makes them less likely to choose you in the first place.
I agree.
Even if it is just a little bit of training.
Agreed. Yeah, it changes the way you hold yourself for sure. And you know, and even if you haven't had that discussion, a lot of people they'll train martial arts. That's what they get. They get the martial arts, and just due to the training, they'll naturally start to hold themselves a certain way. But if you get a good instructor, he'll talk to you about that. And once you have an awareness of it, you could start to have an intelligent process of an education on it. It's not just something you know or you got introduced to. And the more you can do that, the better you can get at it and apply it when it's needed.
Absolutely. Well, Alan, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show today. This has been just a wealth of information. Before we wrap up, you've interviewed before with a lot of people. You're an author and all of that. Is there anything that you wish people asked you about more often?
Wow, that's a good question. You know, I get a lot of questions about the martial arts, the physical training and that type of thing. But the additional information that's taught on the edge of the classroom or the mat. Sometimes that's not in a curriculum and it's not on the wall to learn. But it's, as you know, because you've been in the warrior culture, it's the type of information that will change your life. It'll change how you see things, how you achieve things. It'll affect your daily energy, everything. It's such an amazing mechanism for change. That I can't give enough of. So it's actually one of the reasons I did the book, is to take that information and say, hey, here this is, take a look at it, and use it for improvement, use it for change, regardless of what you are looking to improve. Just grow and better yourself.
It's really interesting. It's really interesting you said that, actually. Last week I did an interview with Jeremy Lesniak and Chris Wilder, a couple of martial arts podcast guys I'm sure you're familiar with. And we were just doing an episode on how to pick a martial arts school. And that was a kind of through line in that about, so there's the stuff on the deck, but watch the conversation off the deck that the teacher has with the little guy. Watch how the transitions run. Watch how the instructors talk when they're not on the mat. All those little tiny things that aren't on the mat, but around the mat.
Agreed.
And it can be some of the best parts of it.
It's huge. And the thing is, it's not that you won't learn that information on the mat and take it with you and have it, but those other things that we're talking about, you will use those things for the rest of your journey. Once you get a little older, maybe you're not expressing yourself physically, but you will still use those mental training tools, those emotional training tools, even the physical training tools. If they're taught to you appropriately, you'll carry them with you for the rest of your life. It's just amazing.
Absolutely agree. Well, again, thank you so much for taking the time today.
It's an honor.
And folks, you can find Alan's website and his Facebook page and his book. I'll put them all in the show notes so you can get more information from this impressively credentialed human being who's taken the time to share some info with us today.
Yeah,
so
reach out.
Thank you very much. Absolutely. Thank you. Today's episode was brought to you by our heroes over at Patreon. Todd Elner, Beth Edwards, Douglas Sedevy, Hugh O'Donnell, Art Brick, American Institutes of Kenpo, Beth Pratt, Richard Hubbard, Wayfinder Advantage, Kit Bradley, Lee Douglas, Amy Rivers, Neil Fastine, Kate Carlson, Brom Payton, Jenny Coakley, and Chris Jordan. Join the illustrious heroes by backing us at patreon.com/safestfamily. If you can't, that's okay, but do consider liking us and subscribing here on YouTube or sharing your favorite episodes on social media. Even a little bit on your end can make a lot of difference here. Thank you for watching today. Stay safe. We'll see you next time.